technically, I guess it's still good morning. My name is Gretchen Spreitzer, and I'd like to welcome you to the first POSLinks session of 2010. And we're delighted to have you all here. I see quite a few familiar faces, but also some new faces. So for those of you that are new, especially welcome. This speaker series is out of our Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship. And it's a series that we offer each month during the school year. And we also put them on the web. So if you come to a session and you really like it and you want to share it with somebody else, you can take a look at our website. You can also see the kind of speakers that we've had over the years as well. A few thank yous. First of all, Janet Max, who always does a great job organizing POSLinks, and for trying a new pizza place today, a healthy pizza alternative. Thank you, Janet. And a big thank you to Paul Jones for his generous support of POSLinks. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. The third person I want to thank is Dave Mayer, who's standing right here. If you haven't met Dave yet, I encourage you to introduce yourself to him. Dave is a new faculty member in the Management and Organizations Department and is partnering with us this term to create a series on behavioral ethics. And so Ann is the first in a line of speakers this winter on behavioral ethics. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Dave. He'll tell you a little bit more about the series, and then he'll introduce Ann. Thank you.
I guess we like to build up to the main course here. But I was thrilled when Gretchen asked me to help organize the POSLinks speaker series for this term. And the focus is on behavioral ethics. So LaRue asked before, he said, I'm here because I want to know what behavioral ethics means. So Ann will tell us a lot more about that as a quick one or two sentence definition of that. Behavioral ethics differs a bit from much of the research and literature on ethics, which takes a philosophical approach to studying ethics. Behavioral ethics takes a behavioral science or social science approach to understand things like why do people engage in unethical or ethical behavior? How do you create an ethical environment in an organization? So Ann's going to be our first speaker in that series. We're going to have Linda Trevino in a couple weeks come in and speak, and then we're just finalizing our third person to come in, all on the same topic. So let me introduce Ann briefly. Ann should feel very comfortable here. She got her BA at University of Michigan, right here. Let me go blue. Yep.
Actually, in engineering.
In engineering.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
She. In addition to keeping herself busy with 3 children, she is really a prolific scholar. After getting her PhD at Northwestern, her first job, and the job she's been at since then, is at Notre Dame. And we figured it was her 15th or 16th year there at Notre Dame. She's also a co-director of one of the Ethics Institute there at Notre Dame. We actually had the dean of the business school at Notre Dame come and give a talk recently. So Ann is really one of the leaders in the field of behavioral ethics, one of the pioneering scholars. And so why don't I pass it over to her?
Thank you. Great. Thanks, Steve. Good job. As Dave said, this is kind of my home university, what I think of it as. I was wondering if there's term limits on being able to call yourself that. This would be 27 years ago since I started here, living in West Quad and commuting up to North Campus there. Certainly great to be back, reconnecting with some people that I've known for a long time now and meeting new people. I believe that most people are ethical. I think most of us intend to be ethical. I think our desire is. That's kind of what I've studied. But having said that, what I'm actually here to do is burst the ethical bubble that I believe most of us live in, and explain perhaps why it is that occurs. To get a handle on that, what I want you to do is rate yourself. In this case, rate yourself how honest you think that you are on a scale of 0 to 100 in comparison to everybody else in this room. If you think you are the least honest person in this room, I want you to give yourself a 0. If you think you are the most honest person in this room, I want you to give yourself a 100. And if you think you're average, I want you to give yourself a 50. And all numbers between 0 and 100 are permissible. Those are just examples of different numbers that you can use as reference point. If I took a poll and actually took an average of your numbers, you would probably be pretty similar to the people that we do this with on a constant basis, most recent being a couple weeks ago with a group of executives. The average is usually around 74, 75, about mid-70s. That can't really be possible because the average is supposed to be 50, since we told people the average is 50. What that's evidence of is that most of us, and I would argue a significant portion of us, rate ourselves as more ethical or believe ourselves to be more ethical than perhaps we really are. All kinds of examples of people asserting that they are more ethical than perhaps they really are. This is going to be a name that culprit. I'm here to tell you right off the bat that I am not guilty of any criminal wrongdoing. I will fight this thing every step of the way. I will fight, I will fight, I will fight till I take my very last breath. I have done nothing wrong. Any thoughts? It would be the ex-governor of my state, Illinois, Rod Blagojevich, accused of trying to sell Barack Obama's seat. This one will be much easier. I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anyone to lie, not a single time. Never. These allegations are false. And then Bill Clinton. And then back to Enron. I take full responsibility for what happened, but saying that I know in my mind that I did nothing criminal. Bringing it back to people that are perhaps more like us, although some would question the normalcy of high school students. A recent survey of 20,000 high school students indicated that nearly 2/3 of teens reported cheating on a test during the past year. More than a third plagiarized off the internet. Nearly a third admitted to stealing from a store in the past year. More than 80% said they lied to their parent about something significant. And note the footnote here. It says these may be conservative because 1 in 4 respondents to this actually admitted to lying on the survey itself. Having said that, though, 93% said they were satisfied with their personal ethics and character. All kinds of reasons as to why these people, and again I'm going to extend it to say us, believe or at least assert that they are more ethical than they really are. One is they may have information that we don't. And that is that if we had the same information that they did, we too would come to the same conclusion that they are as ethical or as right as they're asserting. Another possibility is they actually really don't believe that they're that ethical, but they just don't want to admit that they did anything wrong because they don't want to suffer the repercussions that come with admitting that. But it's really the third possibility that I want to explore, and that is the possibility that they, and again I'm going to extend it to us, walk around believing that we are more ethical than perhaps we really are. To shed light onto why that ethical mirage is allowed to continue, what I've argued with colleagues, Max Bazerman, Kim Wade-Benzoni, and Tina Diekman, is that to understand that phenomenon, we need to really take a look at the decision process that occurs with ethical decision making. And that is more specifically, we need to look at really 3 phases. We need to understand what happens before the decision begins, before we make the decision, when we're predicting how we behave. We need to understand what happens at what I think of as time t0, when we actually make the decision. And then we need to understand what happens at time t+1, when we're looking back and recollecting on that decision. What we argue happens in each of these phases, and what we can be informed by, is that there's a battle between your want self and your should self, and that battle plays out differently in each of these 3 phases, and the pattern of that behavior allows our unethical self to be hidden. I'm going to give you a flavor of that want-should conflict. Let's take 2 examples. First one, you're determined to get up early, you're going to get a fresh start on the day, you've got a lot of things to do, so you set your alarm for that 5:30, knowing if you could just get in that extra hour and a half, life would be great. But sure enough, you wake up, the alarm's going off, and you say, I don't care how much work I have to do, I just want to go back to sleep. Or maybe like many of us at the beginning of the year, you had a New Year's resolution, you're going to be healthy, you're going to start working out, you join a health club, you even sign up for a class to commit yourself. In about the 3rd, 4th week of January, right about now, you're driving by the health club on Wednesday, and instead of turning in to go into the health club, you go home and sit on the couch and veg out. Descriptions of this want-should battle. You think you should get up early and get a fresh start on the day. You think you should be productive. You think you should be healthy and work out. But you want to go back to sleep, and you want to go home and just veg out. That battle between your want self and your should self has been known more fundamentally as the multiple selves problem, where it's been argued that 2 different selves exist within us, and they have different attribute weights for preferences, really leading, in some sense, I know a bizarre notion, to 2 different preferences that exist within us. Dick Thaler made a similar distinction, noting the difference between your planner self and your doer self. And then in another paper, we made a distinction and kind of further characterized this as that distinction between your want and your should self. Want self being the emotional, affective, impulsive, and hot-headed self. Should self being the rational, cognitive, thoughtful, and cool-headed self. That was the original characterization. We started to look at the application of this to ethical dilemmas, thinking of an ethical dilemma often described as that tension between self-interest, protecting self, and ethical principles noted that the want self was more on the self-interested side and the should self more on the ethical implication side. What we argue occurs is that in the prediction phase, our should self wins this battle, so we predict that we behave as we think we should behave. In the action phase, our want self wins out, so we behave in line with the want self, more in the self-interested, unethical side. And then in the recollection phase, that want-should battle is now again won out by the should self, so we believe we behaved as we thought we should, hiding, in some sense, the unethicality of our actions. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about each of those phases, drawing on either my own research or other people's research. I'll spend the most amount of time talking about the action phase. I tend to think of this as the most important because I think it's what we know the least about. In other words, what happens at the time of the decision that kind of causes everything to go out the window. It's also been where I have done more research, so I actually am a little bit more informed in talking about that. So let's start with the prediction phase. And what we argue happens in the prediction phase is that this want-should battle, again, is won out by the should self, that we engage in anticipatory ethics, where we anticipate that we'll behave ethically. But what we know happens in this stage is that we are subject to behavioral forecasting errors. Probably the most compelling example of a behavioral forecasting error comes from a study done by Wodzica and LaFrance, who asked female college students to imagine the following situation. You're interviewing for a research assistant position. You're being interviewed by a male, age 32, for a position on campus. Below are several of the questions that he asks you during the interview. Do you have a boyfriend? Do people find you desirable? And do you think it's important for women to wear bras to work? He asks the students to imagine this situation and to predict how they think that they would behave. Those predictions show that 68% predicted that they would refuse to answer the questions. 62% they would ask the interviewer why or say that that was inappropriate. And 28% said they would take drastic measures, such as getting up and leaving, kind of cutting the interview short, or rudely confronting the interviewer. They then actually put female college students in this situation, posted a job on campus. A male who was 32 interviewed them, and as part of the interview asked them those same 3 questions. And what they found was that no one refused to answer the questions. 52% ignored the harassment and answered the questions. And 26% did ask, but they did so politely and after they had answered them. Indication that how we predict we would behave is often much different than how we actually behave. In a study on negotiations, Tina Diekman, Adam Galinsky, and I looked at what people thought they would do when they were faced with a competitive opponent. Right? Think ahead to the situation. The person's really intimidating, really aggressively. Most people think that they would fight fire with fire. That is, I'm going to combat them, I'm going to stand up to them. So most people predict that they will be more competitive, more likely to use threat, less likely to make concessions. But when actually placed against a more versus a less competitive opponent, they actually became less competitive and as a result reached lower negotiated outcomes than when they were faced with a less competitive opponent. So people predicted they would fight fire with fire. They actually did the reverse. Turns out we're not very good.
You objected to questions during the presentation?
No.
Now, I assume the female students that went through this interview process were selected at random. Suppose
I would assume that too.
selected the members of the hockey team. What, do you think the answers would have been very different, marginally different, hugely different?
So you mean you would pick members of the female hockey team?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So what I do think actually can help alleviate this, and I'll talk very, very briefly, not about this, but about other things, is the more I am in a situation, the more I can accurately predict what that situation is going to be for me. So for female hockey players, I would say they're probably often in situations in which it's characterized by aggression or intimidation. So I might be better able to predict how I'll behave and be prepared for a situation and how to handle that. And that's one of the things that we have found. So the more I'm able to predict, for example, the motivations that might exist, the better able I am to not only guess accurately how I will behave, but actually how to plan for that behavior. So, but more fundamentally, what I know is that in predicting all kinds of behaviors, that we actually think differently, and I'm going to argue that in a few minutes, about the situation than we do at the time of the situation. And that fundamental difference means that we'll often be inaccurate in predicting, though I think experience in the situation, I think it could go both ways. Either it desensitizes me or I gain experience on it. But it allows me to maybe mitigate that force in certain situations. But in general, I think we fall prey to these. And in fact, we fall prey to these in a host of situations, things such as we're not very good at predicting whether or not we're going to go to the dentist or how often, how quickly we can accomplish goals and tasks, whether we're going to cooperate in a social dilemma or give money to various charitable causes, whether we're going to obey an authority or conform to the invalid judgments of our peers. So what we argue then in this prediction phase is that want-should battle is won out by our should self. We believe we're going to behave in line how we think that we should. And yet in the action phase, something very different happens. That want-should battle is won out by the want self. Part of the reason I'm going to argue is because we fall prey to ethical fading. That is, that the ethics get faded from the decision at the time of the decision. And so there's no reason to behave how I think I should behave because this isn't one of those situations. In other words, I don't characterize it as an ethical dilemma. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what do I think contributes to that at the time of the decision. So in this phase, again, we're kind of saying that we say hello to the want self, goodbye to the should self that characterized our process when we were making predictions. Good study in line with this, another example, study of students selecting professors showed that months in advance, students will say things like, I'm going to pick the professor that treats me with dignity and respect, the professor that really contributes to my learning independent of how good of a grade it is that I think that I'm going to get. But at the time of the decision, at registration, they find that that goes out the window, and suddenly you see students that said they were going to pick the hard professor for learning quickly signing up for the professor that's known to give easy grades. More in line with the want-should self, Milkman, Rogers, and Bazerman looked at movie preferences and characterized movies on the want dimension versus the should dimension. Should dimension being things like a documentary, 90 Degrees South with Scott to the Antarctic. Want movie being something like Kill Bill 2. What they found, and they studied, this is like an online movie ordering where you order and then your DVDs arrive at your door and then you return them when you've watched them, is that the want movies, the Kill Bill 2s, were returned much quicker than the should movies. Evidence, they argued, for this notion that when I'm ordering, the should self has some voice. If I'm going to sit in front of the TV for 2 hours, the least I can do is watch something educational, watch something informative, kind of inform my mind. But the time of the decision when I'm sitting out, I don't care about that. All I want to do is veg out, and Kill Bill 2 wins. Different reasons, and why I think it perpetuates really every one of us in a lot of different situations, why this occurs. And these reasons are interrelated. It's been argued that two different processes are kind of occurring in the prediction versus the action phase. In the prediction phase, desirability concerns dominate. So I think about how I desire to behave or desirable behaviors. But at the time of the decision, feasibility concerns take over. So in a study of daffodil days, you're on campus, people ask if you want to contribute to the charity. 80% of students say, I would contribute. I would definitely give the $5. At the time that they're actually approached on campus, they find that only half of those that said that they would do contribute. And part of the reason is this feasibility, and that is, gee, I only have $5, so it's a choice between giving it to you and buying my lunch. Concerns that really didn't dominate when I was thinking about how I would behave. Similarly, it's been argued that we think differently about the decision. That is, at the time of thinking, predicting, looking ahead, I'm looking at the forest. So it's been shown that we're much more abstract thinkers when we're predicting. At the time of the decision, we're looking at the tree or maybe even the bark on the tree. That is, we're looking very, very detailed and not at general principles that guide our life. We found, relatedly, that another difference was difference in motivations, and that is the motivation that I think will drive me at the time of the decision is actually different than what does drive me. So back to that competitive negotiation example, what we argued was that people in prediction are thinking that their motivation is going to stand up to being bullied, right, to not give away one's ground, but at the time of the negotiation, I just want it to go through. Or at the time of the sexual harassment, I need the job. I'll worry about standing up to sexual harassment later. Found support for that, and that is the blue here being those people forecasting, higher bars being more likely, going head-to-head, not being bullied, standing one's ground, and winning. Very important to those people forecasting, significantly more than those people actually in the negotiation. Avoiding an impasse, having a smooth interaction, and just getting along being more important for those people actually in the negotiation. So differences in motivation come into play. What I want to spend time on, though, is an additional reason that we think comes into play, and that is this role of ethical fading. And that is that at the time of the decision, there are various forces that cause the ethics to go out. I no longer see it as an ethical dilemma, and so there's no reason for that should self to be activated because it's not a situation that requires that. To understand that, it might be useful to look at a classic model, and I apologize for the red not showing up very well, of ethical decision making. This is Russ' model, very well formulated, has served as the basis of several ethics reviews, business ethics reviews. It certainly received some empirical support. What the model suggests is that we go through 4 phases in making an ethical decision, that we begin with moral awareness. Moral awareness moves to moral judgment. That's the second square up there on the right, which in turn moves to moral intention, and in turn informs moral behavior. Like I said, well supported, I think well grounded. But what Dave Messick and I became concerned with several years ago is, what if we never get to square one? That is, what if we actually are never really morally aware? Then all of our ethics training that exists in business schools and in organization that says, in these situations, here's some different judgments you may want to apply, right? Here's some different stakeholders. That never actually comes into my decision process because I never was aware that this is one of those situations in which I needed to apply those judgments or those stakeholders. We were then concerned and labeled kind of our concern around this notion of ethical fading, a process that we said was consciously or subconsciously the process by which the moral colors of an ethical decision fade into bleached hues that are void of moral implications. That is, the ethics go away. Argued that that process began with these cues in the environment, and I'm going to talk about 2, that leads to a process of self-deception, which in turn influences the way that I characterize the decision. All this will make more sense as we go forward. And the way that I characterize that decision, in turn, influences my propensity to engage in unethical behavior. Variety of different situational cues, so first square and last square, have been associated with unethical behavior. Things like incentives, uncertainty, standards, surveillance systems, the target of my behavior, so who you are influences my likelihood in engaging in this behavior towards you, and the power structure that exists between us. What I want to do is talk about the two that are highlighted. Surveillance systems, can think of them as compliance systems as well, and who you are as influences on unethical behavior, and that the reason that they influence that unethical behavior, we find, is because they change the type of decision with which individuals feel that they're faced. In other words, they help fade the ethics from the decision, increasing the likelihood that I behave in a self-interested choice because it's not an ethical dilemma. We became interested, this is again work with Dave Messick, in surveillance systems because it seems like such a popular solution to ethics. That the way we're going to get people to behave ethically is we're going to, in some sense, going way back to kind of Bernard's command and control theory, we're going to kind of, in some sense, force them to. We're going to set up standards, we're going to measure your behavior relative to that standard, and if you're caught deviating from that, we're going to punish you. Probably the best quote as it relates to ethics is here, such that the failure to seriously monitor, measure, and reward the performance of individuals on an ethical plane is going to leave them operating in a vacuum of little use in actually promoting behavior. So we need these systems. Yet we were concerned about this because we know about kind of the downsides of surveillance systems. Here's a more recent application of surveillance systems, and that is Sarbanes-Oxley. You know, I was so excited to see certainly the attention of the world on ethics. I was telling a few that back in '94, when I was giving job talks, I was asked by a university, what are you going to do when ethics is no longer a fad? And so certainly the ethics scandals have helped keep me in business, but I wasn't studying it because it was a fad. So I was excited to see the attention, but I was a little bit dismayed about the focus of what has become that attention, and that is this regulation of ethics, that is in some sense setting up these command and control. So we know that Sarbanes-Oxley requires anti-corruption tools like internal control systems. There's been a whole industry that has sprung up because of that. In-house watchdogs or compliance officers now required at all public corporations, making chief compliance officers almost as important to corporate success, or at least survival, as chief executives and chief financial officers, which has many good sides to it. I've actually been to conferences with compliance officers, and I think they have the best intentions. What I think is important is to understand psychologically how do these type of systems change our behavior. And we know that they do. That is, that surveillance systems, or these command and control compliance systems, we know, lead to decreased trust, resentment, create oppositional relationships. We feel more pressure and tension, which results in decreased creativity, positive emotions, and lower self-esteem, and also cognitively, a reduction in cognitive flexibility, and also in intrinsic motivation. So in looking at this, we were informed by a couple of things that were going on, or had been recent ways of thinking. And that is, theoretically, there was a movement started by March and then later followed up by Dave Messick on something called the logic of appropriateness theory. And what these folks were saying was that the very first thing that I do when faced with a decision is I ask myself, what type of decision is this? So I first ask myself, what is this decision? And after that, all of the things that those of us in this field measure are naturally predicted. So once I decide what decision this is, my behavior, my expectations of how you would behave, my expectations of what the norms are, can easily be predicted by understanding what type of decision is this. So powerful that Dave Messick has argued we could go back and re-explain much more simply almost all the work that's been done in social science if we could first understand from participant standpoint what type of decision they felt that they were called to make. Empirically, there was a few things going on that were informing us as well. Rick Larrick and Sally Blount were interested in two different types of games used to study cooperation, ultimatum games and prisoner dilemma games. Why there were big differences in cooperation when the payoff structures were kind of the same. What they argued and found support for was that they used different linguistic cues. So things like claiming value versus accepting or rejecting led people to behave differently. And they found by just switching the words, they could actually reverse the pattern of cooperation. What we thought was actually going on there was those linguistic cues changed this first question. That is, what type of situation is this? And that then led to the difference in behavior. Similarly, it's been found that describing social dilemmas in just different terms, same payoff structure, but social goods versus monetary goods, substantially influences cooperation rates. And again, we were thinking that this occurs because it changes the type of decision with which I feel that I'm faced. So that led us to a couple questions. And I'm going to speak real briefly about why we're saying weak sanctioning systems here. Can weak sanctioning systems and surveillance systems have adverse effects, increasing the undesirable behavior that they're actually designed to decrease? And is that because they change this type of decision, this decision frame with which individuals feel that they're faced, fading the ethics, decreasing the likelihood that they're going to see the ethical implications of that decision? We focus on weak, and we did also look at strong, and I can explain that if I have time, because I think most systems are weak. I think it's really hard to create a 100% foolproof system where you're watching people at all times. And what we do know about human behavior from some of Cialdini's work is that most people find ways to trick or bypass the system. So they find ways to kind of get around it. So even if you can create a strong one, people find loopholes in the system or ways to get around it. To do that, we ran a series of studies. This is just an overview of kind of the generalities of one of them. We asked people to assume the following: that you're a manufacturer in an industry which produces a toxic gas, that there's some notion that the environmentalists are concerned about this situation, and there's some movement underfoot that they're going to kind of take this to court, make a big issue out of it, and that the most likely outcome is that it's going to result in people having manufacturers run their scrubbers 100% of the time, which helps clean up this gas, but very expensive. So faced with kind of the expensive legal costs plus the 100% compliance costs, the manufacturers got together and reached an agreement that said, well, you know what, why don't we all run our scrubbers 80% of the time? That's certainly more expensive than what we're doing now, but less expensive than our alternative. And so each manufacturer in this case had to decide, do I go back, when it's now up to me, do I go back and run the scrubbers, keep to my promise, and help the environment, or don't I? For half the people, they were told there's going to be no inspections or enforcement of the agreement. It's really up to you, to what you decide. For the other half, they were told that there's going to be some random checks, but that it was going to be kind of weak. There's less than a 5% chance of being inspected, and that even if they were caught, the fine was negligible, and in all the costs, they were giving obviously a lot more detail than this, but the cost, $50,000, was really small in comparison to some of the other things they were looking at. What we were predicting, keep in mind, is that putting on a weak sanction was actually going to increase the extent to which people defected on their agreement or decided not to run their scrubbers 80% of the time. This is really in contradiction to what pure economists would predict, and that is, they'd say if you put a fine on a behavior, either nothing will happen because it's so small it's negligible, so they're really the same, or you should see a slight decrease in that behavior because it's financially less attractive. The payoff is less. We're actually arguing the reverse, that though it's financially less attractive, that you're going to see more of that behavior, and that the reason for that is because it changes the type of decision with which individuals feel that they're faced. So to get at that, we had people answer, in addition to how much you're going to run your scrubbers, if you had to choose one description for this decision, how would you describe it? Do you think it's a personal decision, a business, and an ethical, environmental, illegal, or other? And there was a line, and they could write their own. Surprising to us, everybody but 2 people chose business or ethical. I thought there'd be some big environmental, because there was certainly big it was an environmental study. There were talks about the legal costs, the legal consequences. But the 2 biggest ones, and by far, were business and ethical. So I'm going to focus on those. And the answer to my 2 questions, would it increase the undesirable behaviors they were designed to decrease? And was that because it changed the type of the decision? The answers were yes and yes. So with no sanctioning system, 61% of the people adhered to their agreement, ran their scrubbers 80% of the time. When there's a weak sanctioning system, significantly less did that, at 45% of the time. And sanctioning systems influence that type of decision with which individuals felt that they were faced. Those people who said, it's really up to you, there's not going to be any inspections, the majority of people saw it, E being ethical, B being business. Majority of people saw it as an ethical decision. But when there was a sanctioning system put in place, a majority of the people saw it as a business decision. So the 2 questions were different that they were in some sense asking themselves in these situations. When I see it as an ethical decision, it's what's the right thing to do. That becomes my decision process. When I see it as a business decision, we saw it as more of a calculative decision. Well, what's the probability of getting caught? What's the likelihood I'll get caught? Subtract that. Gosh, it seems to make sense, right, to behave this way. Ethical implications no longer part of the decision. And in fact, we found that decision frame fully mediated this relationship so that it fully explained the difference in behavior was driven by the adoption of a different decision frame. Strong sanctioning systems, real quick, we ran, and certainly the bigger the sanctioning system, if it's a $4 million fine, I'm more likely to comply. The problem is it still changed the decision, so people still saw it as a business decision. And so as soon as that sanctioning system breaks down, people find ways around it, I'm no longer asking myself what's the right thing to do, and so behavior falls. To give you a different example, totally different, because I'm not necessarily anti-regulation at all. I think we just need to understand how do people behave in response to systems that are set up. I'll take you to another interest of mine, which is the target type, kind of the victim, if you will, of my behavior. And what I was interested in a really long time ago, in fact, as part of my job talk, in terms of future research, is why is it that certain situations seem okay to us, not corporations to individuals, which is what a lot of people study, but individuals to corporations. So what is it about Microsoft that, I feel like it's okay to kind of download or copy people's software? Or what is it about the IRS, right? Or what is it about insurance companies that somehow provide a legitimation of my unethical behavior? It's actually captured in this cartoon. Taking something that's not yours is absolutely wrong. No matter how you sugarcoat it, it's just plain stealing, unless, of course, you're talking about insurance claims or company supplies. So I was kind of interested in those situations. And when I looked at the research, I realized we really didn't understand very much about unethical behavior from an individual towards groups versus individuals. So that I needed to start there, and that's where I still am. Many revise and resubmits later, I'm still working through that. So we know that you being a group changes my perception of the target. So interacting with a group not only promotes the schema that you're going to be more competitive as a group, unfriendly and aggressive, but also more deceitful and unethical. Jeff Polzer's work shows that in general I expect groups to be more dishonest than I expect individuals to be. And then many of us have argued that my expectations of you influence my own behavior. So if I think you're going to be unethical, it's been found I'm more likely to be unethical to you. And if you're a group and I think you're going to be more likely to be unethical, then that would suggest a pretty simple hypothesis. That is, that individuals are more likely to stretch the truth when they're interacting with a group than when they're interacting with an individual. I've run a series of studies on this. Quick one that I'll share with you involves a dictator game. So let me back up and say that this is a variation of an ultimatum game. And an ultimatum game looks like this. I have a pot of money to allocate. I allocate it to Norm, a portion of that. I say, Norm, I'm going to give you this amount. I'm going to take the rest. Norm can say yes, in which case Norm gets what I offered him and I get what's left. Or he can say no and we both end up with 0. So I say, I've got 100, Norm, I'm going to give you 20. I'm going to take 80. If he says yes, he gets 20, I get 80. If he says no, we both get 0. This is a variation on that, and that is that Norm had no ability to reject my offer. So he had to accept what portion of the pot it was that I was allocating. And he also didn't know what the size was. So I knew that it was $87, and Norm was told it's somewhere between $5 and $90. I had to, when I made him the offer, I had to say, here's what I'm going to offer you, Norm, and here's my honest, and that's what it said, the honest size of my pot is blank. That was really the measure we were interested in, right? Because we wanted to look at to what extent did Norm being a group of norms versus Norm influence that behavior. And even more specific, I actually didn't know it was Norm. He didn't know it was me. It was totally anonymous and confidential. All designed, I didn't want any behavior of Norm or my attributions of him to influence. It's just, was it a group or was it an individual? To manipulate that, I was either told that the recipient's going to be individual, you'll be making an offer to a single individual, or it's going to be a group of individuals and you'll be making an offer to this group. That was the only difference. It was a multi-page description, but that was the only difference. And sure enough, when the target was an individual, the participants reported a pot size of about 71. Remember, the honest was 87. 45% of people misrepresented the size of their pot. But when the target was a group, they reported a pot size of about $50 with 76% engaging in misrepresentation. More fundamental to this talk is that difference actually changed the type of decision with which I was faced, such that those people who were allocating to an individual, the majority of people thought it was an ethical decision, where the majority of people allocating to a plurality or a group saw it as a business decision. And in fact, looking at their comments, they said it's like a big corporation. It was very related to what we thought was occurring. It was like allocating to a big corporation versus a person. That's what they saw the difference as, even though it wasn't characterized as that. And in fact, the adoption of the business frame fully mediated, again, or explained the relationship between individual versus group and whether or not I engaged in misrepresentation. So what we're arguing occurs at the action phase is that the ethics fade from the window, and that want-should battle is almost irrelevant because there is no should. It's no longer a battle. This is not an ethical decision. I don't see it as that. And so as a result, kind of my self-interested, kind of protect self can come out. Questions, and certainly an interesting question, and one that I think is deserving of significant more research, is why does this occur? One of the reasons that this occurs is what has been known as visceral responses. So things like hunger, fatigue, anger, and pain, that they kind of overtake us, and our kind of motivation becomes one in which we want to mitigate that force. So I have made a resolution. I am no longer going to eat sweets. I want to drop a few pounds. That's just going to be the way I'm going to do it. And yet I was in meetings all day, and I end up at a meeting in the afternoon, and a big old plate of brownies is getting passed around. I don't care if that was kind of what I said. I'm so hungry right now that I need to alleviate that. Or I don't care if I need to stay up 2 more hours to finish this deadline. I have got to go to sleep. So this disconnect between deliberation and action is impeded by what's known as these visceral responses or transient forces. My motivation is to mitigate that force, and this is often an unconscious response. This is tangentially related, those of you familiar with Haidt's work, on kind of intuitional approaches to ethical decision-making, where Haidt argues that we kind of make really quick, unconscious reactions to moral dilemmas, and that it's only later that we engage in reasoning, and the reasoning we engage in is just designed to support that decision. So he uses very kind of reactionary dilemmas, like sex between siblings, eating your dog, burning a flag, and says that, we just have unconscious. We don't think about them. We decide right away, and then we engage in reasoning to support that. Some would argue that that's situation-specific, that not all situations fit kind of that reactionary process that goes through. And as I'll argue later, the debate here is it's emotion, then cognition, emotion. I think that both occur, that it's really both interacting with each other. But point being that there are just these things that I react to, and I'm often not aware of them. And so I don't really deliberate on the ethics. Other contributors that I've worked on and others that I just will briefly mention, repeated exposure can also cause ethical fading. So it's been found that, for example, execution support teams, those that work with the victims and the criminals around executions, find that they become, along Dave's work, more and more morally disengaged the more executions that they witness. Organizations and their ethical infrastructure also, and actually Elizabeth's name, it starts with a U. I was using euphemisms and thought it started as E, so sorry, Elizabeth. But we've argued that you need to understand kind of the infrastructure that exists around ethics in an organization. So things like not just the formal systems, do you have a formal training program, do you have an ombudsman, do you have corporate training on ethics, but what are the informal pressures that exist? Who really gets rewarded, right? So the informal pressures, language euphemisms that might desensitize ethics. So do I use creative accounting and creative selling or aggressive selling rather than kind of cooking the books and lying to my customers? Or do I use firing, or do I use right-sizing? So those kind of words that kind of hide the ethicality also send a signal to people that ethicality is not that important. Classic Pinot case, I think you can put in kind of this theory or this explanation of process where a lot of analysis has suggested that part of the decision, anyway, came down to a decision between do I spend $11 to fix each Pinto, and they actually did go through this analysis, or do I worry about the lawsuits, and they made the trade-off between the potential cost of lawsuits and $11 per car, a purely business, and I would almost argue what we teach, right, a trade-off analysis. But whether or not I should engage in that behavior actually never entered. And I think, and we write this in a different paper, I think all of those people were probably well-intentioned. Again, I think it's oftentimes these things unknowing to me that hide the ethics from my behavior. And in a book that Max Bazerman and I are arguing, we also argue regulatory systems can change the decision. It becomes a legal issue, right? It becomes what is the law versus how should I behave. So we've argued that in prediction, this want-should battle again is won out by the should self. In action, due in part to ethical fading, that the want self wins out because there's really no should to be had. But now we're here in T+1, recollecting back on that decision that we made. And we have to reconcile the fact that it's not how we thought we would behave, and it's actually not in line with the ethical person that we think that we are. What we argue happens in this phase is that the should self reappears, that we feel a need for cleansing. And in fact, Chenbo Zhang and Katie Lillenquist have shown kind of how effective cleansing is. When people commit, say, a morally inappropriate act, and they're given the opportunity to actually wash their hands, they feel less of a need to compensate for that morally inappropriate act. We argue that in addition to physical cleansing, that we go through psychological cleansing, kind of cleansing away the badness of that behavior in a process known as revisionary ethics. All kinds of examples of people engaging in this. This is one of the more repulsive, a group of Holocaust deniers. If you look at their rationalizations, they kind of fit under some of the processes I'm going to talk about. They say there was actually no official policy for exterminating Jews, therefore it didn't happen. They did not use gas chambers. That series of the Holocaust were actually created and fabricated, with evidence being fabricated, that the number of deaths is a gross exaggeration, so creating uncertainty around what actually happened. Same thing here, contains errors and are inconsistent. That the way that they were obtained were via torture, so they couldn't be counted. And probably the most common rationalization that we see for unethical behavior, and that is you did it to me, so it was okay for me to do it to you. In other words, that the treatment was the same as what the Allies did to their enemies. We see some of that similar revisionary ethics in Ken Lay's account. As Ken Lay describes it, the Enron collapse was the outgrowth of the wrong-headed and criminal acts of the company's finance organization, and specifically its CFO, Andrew Fastow. He says that both he and the board were misled by Mr. Fastow about the activities and true natures of a series of off-the-books partnership that played a decisive role in the company's collapse. So blaming someone else, it's someone else's fault, but still argues that some of the most controversial decisions, including some that set up conflicts of interest for Fastow that could well be unprecedented, were made for good reasons and could only have been seen as mistakes in hindsight, what we would call a rationalization. If we look more kind of systematically, these are representatives of the different processes that occur in the recollection phases. Like the difference between prediction and action, the difference between recollection and action is also argued to be different. Temporal construal theory saying, again, now that I'm in this recollection, I'm back to the forest level. So I'm back to looking at very abstractly what happened and general principles that guided my behavior. So I look back, for example, say at this negotiation that I had about a job, and I say, you know what, in general, I was ethical. And I don't actually look at the specific details. This has been used to explain why we often recall past vacations more favorably than perhaps we actually experience them. So I look back and I say, general time off, time with the kids, away from work. And yet I forget that at the time it was hot, I was overcharged, my kids were whiny, and a crisis came up at work and I was on my BlackBerry anyway. As part of this memory revisionism, we engage in what's known as confirmatory searches. So when I do look at the trees, I look at only the trees that support my self-image. So I look for the evidence that supports who I think that I am versus evidence to the contrary. So I may remember that in that job interview, I told the truth about what my past salary was. I told the truth about where I wanted to be located, that I was married and my spouse would need a job. And I just kind of don't code into memory the fact that I implied that I had other offers that I really didn't have. So I remember that which supports, and I don't remember that which does not. We also engage in biased attributions and post hoc rationalization. So like we saw, if I see details, the bad trees that I don't want to see, so I try not to see the details. When I do see the details, I see the good ones. But if I do see the bad ones, one of two things happens. If I can, I blame someone else for that. I come up with a justification, as we saw, for why that occurred. And then if all else fails, we argue that you engage in kind of adjusting your ethical standards. So suddenly what you thought was unethical before you behaved, you say, you know what, now that I think about it, that really is not that unethical. And I change my behavior so that it falls just within that ethical standard. So I say, you know what, I implied that I had other job offers, but that's not really lying. I never told them what it was or how much I was making. It's been found, for example, that attitudes towards child labor, and I forgot the cite on that, falls prey to this. So after I purchase an item knowingly that was made in a sweatshop with children in it, it's been found that people change their attitudes about how unethical or immoral that is to have sweatshops characterized by children. So it comes after the decision. So what we've argued is that there's these three phases, and the want-should battle plays out differently. Should winning in prediction and recollection, the want-self winning in the action phase. And so it's really this bookend kind of process where both before and after the decision, I think I behaved or I will behave like I think I should behave, and kind of hidden in the middle is the way that I actually behaved. The problem is that we know that effective decision-making requires that we accurately plan and receive appropriate feedback about that decision. And what we're arguing here is the planning and reflection doesn't accurately reflect that decision. And so my well-intended actions and my desire to be ethical get hidden. Practically, there's some implications that fall from this. And I think there is, and in a different paper, we go into more depth on kind of the implications for what this means for training individuals in ethics. Ethics training has definitely found mixed results, some successes, but not as many would hope for that are in the business. And this again includes what happens at universities and in organizations. So 80% of MBAs state they feel less prepared to face ethical dilemmas the longer they're in school more and more, particularly in this time period, including ethics training. Again, what we think happens is that the ethics training doesn't take into account the psychological processes of well-intended, which we believe most people are, well-intended individuals, what happens to them, and how the situation adds to this ethical fading. So I don't characterize it, so I never bring up that which I was educated on because it doesn't seem relevant. We argue we need to do to enhance this training is we need to understand this trichotomy of these three phases and what happens. And we can draw on some of the research that's been done on this, not most of it, in ethical dilemmas. First of all, I do think we need to recognize multiple selves. Very Freudian, I know, the idea of like little people running around in your head is bizarre, but I do think we can all point to situations where I had two preferences, that there were two good choices, maybe one that was more self-interested and one that wasn't, and recognize that we do have kind of these competing preferences. During the prediction phase, we need to anticipate the influence of the want self. So we need to say, when I'm thinking about that decision, guess what? I may not behave like I think that I'm behave, because there is going to be this self-interest that may not be very apparent to me right now, but it is going to be apparent at the time. And it's in fact going to be very dominant. We don't want to do just that, though. I don't want to just predict, oh, guess what? I think I'm going to behave unethical. That's the way it is. So we don't want to just kind of improve our prediction accuracy. We actually want to use that knowledge of what's going to happen as a way to help us at that time t0. Different things have been shown to be helpful in this. Again, not specifically in ethics, but that we draw on to say perhaps they could be. One is what is known as pre-constraints, and that is if you can find a way to constrain that want self, if you can find a way to constrain self-interest, in some sense not allow it to be operable, you can increase the likelihood that it doesn't win. So an interesting study of farmers in the Philippines in rural areas has found that those that use what are known as, or offered and use, lock boxes. So they put their wages, they lock their wages away. The opposite of interest, I pay you to take my money and keep it away. That they have higher savings than the people that don't. They're paying, so actually their wages are less. But overall, their savings is greater because their want self can't win. It's put away and they actually can't react impulsively because they don't have it. Also been argued that if we could try, at the time of the decision, to think more abstractly, more forest level, that we're more likely to behave how we think we should behave. So a study of people eating pretzels, they found that if you could get people to think abstractly about kind of the shape of a pretzel and kind of the abstract qualities versus how good that salt tastes on that warm bread, that it decreased the temptation for people to eat that pretzel. Classic marshmallow study with kids in temptation did the same thing. And as they placed a marshmallow in front of a child, and if they could get them to think about like it was a cloud and things like that, it didn't necessarily decrease how likely they were, just the time in which they were able to avoid eating that. So thinking abstractly about principles that guide your life, general principles versus the details of that one situation, can also be useful. Delayed consequences of implementing a should self-choice also has been found to be effective. So I might say, I don't have any time right now or any money right now to invest in my 401k, no way. But you know what? I'll do it a year from now. And this pay later has actually been found to increase people's behavior in line with their should self. So what's interesting about this is this actually preys on our prediction errors. That is, I assume in a year from now, I'll have more money. That's actually an inaccurate prediction, just like I assume in a year from now I will be less busy, which is why I commit to things that I shouldn't, but probably the best predictor of how much money and how busy I am is right now. However busy and how much money I have right now is pretty predictive of how I'll be. But because we're inaccurate predictors, we predict we're going to have more money, and we can actually use that to our advantage, for example, in that case, as a way to implement a should self-choice. Also been found that we examine two options at the same time. So, for example, cheap product versus product, this study was done with printers that are better for the environment. That if I look at them one at a time, because I don't see the other choice, oh, cheap printer, sounds good. The salience of behaving unethically is kind of hidden. But when I compare the two to each other, self-interested choice versus a more ethical choice or environmentally friendly, I'm more likely to pick the more environmentally friendly. So a question to ask, most decisions come at us one at a time, so it's kind of hard to say, well, I'd like to have two choices. But I think if we can ask ourselves, what am I not choosing, right? Even though it may not be salient, that may increase the likelihood that we behave as we think that we should. And then obviously during the recollection phase, we need to recognize our distortions that occur. Research follows just along those same lines. We need to improve our prediction accuracy. That is, we need to make sure we're ready for the battle that occurs at the time t0. We have found, for example, with Tina Diekman and Adam Galinsky, if you can get people to think about what motivations will actually motivate you at the time. So, for example, in the negotiation standpoint, what is going to motivate you? The people are much more accurate in how they think that they'll behave. They realize they're not going to fight fire with fire. If you can get people in that job situation to think about what's actually, they're going to say, oh, you know what, getting the job is going to be important. What do I need to do to prepare for that? I think, a big area of research as well is what I think of as this T0 problem. That is, what happens at the time where all my good planning and all my great intentions kind of subconsciously go out the window? What are some of those contributors to ethical fading? And then I think we've done a great job, for those of us that have studied behavioral decision theory, identifying all these biases that occur. I talked about the ones in the recollection. We've done a terrible job of trying to de-bias people. People have tried. We haven't found a way to de-bias people. So I think that's also a fruitful area of research, is how do we de-bias. The end, what I think we're arguing is this want-should coexist, and is really a lot in line with like Damasio's stuff on dual process models. This cognition, emotion, emotion, cognition. I think that they both happen. I think that these systems that people have focused their attention and energy on that are important, but they're not the whole picture. And we need to understand when do emotions take over, when do cognitions take over, and really how do we get those two systems, want, should, emotion, cognition, to talk to each other and inform each other, so that at the end of the day we don't have two selves. We try to bring those two selves together so that we can behave in line with how we think that we should behave or how we would like to behave. That's the end of my talk. Thank you for being very patient. And I'll certainly take any questions.
How does poor planning relate to your ethical decision? It seemed to me that some of the examples that you placed up to us were actually started by poor planning in the first place, and not basically just a bad ethical decision.
I think actually it's an incredible, significant influence. I think one of the reasons for poor planning is I'm not very accurate at predicting what's going to happen at the time of the decision. So I think there's all kinds of, there's just laziness, right? Kind of cognitive laziness that says I don't need to prepare for everything that I need to. But I also think there's a kind of bias in that I see what I want to do, and I don't code in the other things that may happen. So confirmatory searches that occur not just in recollection, but in the prediction that say, here's what I'd like to do, so let me find all the reasons to justify why that's a good decision, and I don't take into account the other, which means I'm not planning for those contingencies or different motivations that come into play. So I think part of it, though, is I'm in the prediction mode, or in the planning mode, and I'm just not accurately accounting for all of the possibilities. So I only select on a subset of outcomes that are in my favor. So what I always say to people when I'm, say counseling them on negotiation, I get a job offer, and you say, what's your alternative? And they say, I don't have one. But certainly waiting is an alternative, right? Or when you're selling your house, you can say, you know what? I'm not taking this lowball offer. I'm going to wait. I'm sure there's a better offer coming along. What you have to include is a probability that there will be no offer coming along. So sure, there's a possibility there's a 20% probability you'll get this offer, a 30%, but there's also maybe a 20% chance that in a year from now you will have no offer, or significantly less than what you're getting. So as part of our planning, and we know this, we are biased in kind of our confirmatory searches. So I look for the evidence that supports the likelihood that I'll get a high offer if I wait. But I ignore evidence to the contrary. So certainly having people that aren't as vested, so the more vested we are in that decision, the more we fall prey to this. So having people that don't care the way that it turns out can help us shed light on the other half that we're ignoring. And accurately thinking, in this case, from an ethical decision about what motivations are going to come into play at the time of the decision will help you at least prepare for the likelihood that you aren't going to behave as you thought that you would. Now the question is how are you going to prevent that at the time of the decision? So I think you're right that a lot of it is poor planning, and I think of it as poor planning and not being aware of these what visceral responses will be coming my way, how important will it be to get that job as that intern kind of come into play, also lead to that. Yeah.
I don't have any work like doing myself around the IRS or insurance, and I felt different what I would do and act that way, and I wouldn't try to even think that I wasn't doing that. And I get the idea, I can see times in my life where I predicted one thing, acted differently, and then tried to make it better.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some situations in my life where I predicted very strongly that I would behave in a certain way, did not behave in that way, and there's nothing that I can do to right that inside myself. And I feel like it haunts me. I feel like that was wrong, I know it was wrong, and I really disappointed myself for not standing up and doing something different. Can you shed any light on that, and what do I do now?
Yeah, so, and I'm with you on that. I do think that, and I can't remember who I was talking to this about, but so I think there's range of extremeness, if I want to kind of quantify this, of deviations, right? So how very unethical, or how much did I deviate, right, from how much I thought? That there are outliers, and they could be very beneficial outliers, I think. So I don't think this characterizes every decision that we make. So these really outliers that I go through all this process and it just doesn't work, quite frankly. Those are the ones that I think I learn from, right? So the really, really big ones are the ones that I learn from. What concerns me is, so you would say, well, then who cares if they're the little ones? But I think over time, the little ones can become big ones along a series of incremental steps. So, if I go, my gradations are, billable hours. I need to add in a half hour. What's a half hour? And then next month I need to add in an hour. Well, now it's only a half hour difference, and next month it's an hour and a half. Over time, and it's been argued, there's some evidence for it, that they're so small that those rationalizations can take place. But when they're so big, when you go from 0 to 100, you can't. And those are the ones that I think you say, yikes, why would I ever do that? And I think you are more insightful in your recollection that allows at least for accurate feedback for the next time. But I think the problem is they're so infrequent, those big ones.
The other question I have about it, in this case, it was somebody was being extremely verbally abusive to someone, and I'd heard about this person before, and of course, they wanted to stand up and say something, of course, and then I was in the presence of this, and I literally felt hijacked in my physical being, as though I were rendered helpless. You know, like something happened, it was like maybe a fight or flight thing or something.
That's what I think it is, actually.
Paralyzed
Absolutely.
event.
So that's actually what I've characterized this T0 problem as, is fight or flight. And at the time of the decision, I've got to protect self. I think it's innately built in us. So I think that in the prediction phase, you could say to yourself, next time, this is what I try to do. But next time it's happening, and I've tried to voice out loud what are the things that I would say? I think that's really inappropriate, right? And you've got to think through, what are the ramifications of saying that, right? But if you make that choice that that's kind of the behavior you want to enact, then planning for that and voicing it gives you at least some of the confidence to be prepared to face that situation. It's so funny you say that, though, because I've heard that exact same story from somebody else before, is being in the presence of somebody being verbally abused. So you're certainly not alone in the hijacked feeling. And I think just planning and saying to yourself, what are the things that I'm going to say the next time? The good thing is you've noticed it, so you're not hiding. Jane? Sure.
Because it links to the question I had, what's the role of other people at this action stage? And sort of thinking that solutions you're giving to us are pretty much individualistic solutions about sort of improving ourselves as individual decision makers, but much less about, again, as organizations, how we can change the relationships between people that might embolden people to be in a space of sort of ethical greatness and not move to this is a business problem.
Right.
What does your research suggest about the role of other people?
So not specifically this, but the role on ethical infrastructure says that the informal norms that we talked about are important in the organization. So if I were CEO, and this is what we've argued, is may not be a recommendation you want to hear, but you have to hear it. It's easy to say, we'll just have an ethics program, right? We'll have an ombudsman. It's really difficult to say what's really going on the shop floor. So as a CEO, I'd figure out what are the real pressures that are going on. What language? I think language is huge. What language is used? Who really is getting rewarded? So those are things that, while emboldening people to maybe stand up, is different in saying how do we bring ethics back into each decision, not the big ones, not the ones that rise up to the compliance officer, but all of the small decisions. And certainly there's tone at the top. There's kind of cohesiveness of organizations. There's selection, though I'm not necessarily convinced on the selection tools. So from an individual, this is what kind of I can do. I think there's a whole host of things that organizations can do. I hate to say this in a university, but I'm in one too, so I can say it. I think we have to really, honestly, I think we have to look at business schools and say, what is the curriculum that we're teaching? We teach the base of agency theory is you shouldn't trust people, and we just assume that, and then we go teach people that. So I think we need to understand what are the models that we're using that are great models, and to what extent do those models and those premises, what assumption? They all have assumptions. What assumptions they have that lead people to assume? So even the model behind a reward system. So that's the really hard work and kind of the dirty work that I think needs to be done, is examining how very sound theories that we give to businesses have a set of implicit assumptions in them. Yeah.
Some of what you're speaking about makes me think about the work that Lynn Payne did around integrity-based systems versus compliance-based systems. I actually wanted to ask you, how far your research has gone beyond just sort of American culture as far as other cultures are concerned, but maybe I can answer about what Jane was talking about.
Yeah,
in some ways,
absolutely.
The work I did with the Amsterdam Business School in Holland is really sort of focused on this idea of how do you build integrity and trust at a larger level, at an organizational level. I'm not sure you've heard this idea that they have in Dutch government or in regulatory agencies. They're called high trust supervision.
Interesting.
This idea that, in a sense, you allow more integrity to take place in the agencies, they do still fine, they do still punish, but only larger amounts and
Right.
less often. So
Right.
leaving this or trying to build this attitude of trust. It really comes from this basis of, if you're allowed the opportunity
Right.
to regulate and govern yourself, take your own initiative, that you'll hold yourself to a higher standard.
So absolutely, and it sends that, going back to that logic of appropriateness, what type of situation is this? It sends a situation, this is one in which I am to be trusted. Right? At the very base of that, it says that this is a system that trusts me, and I'm going to hold myself to that standard. That is the norm. Not that there's not going to be deviance from that norm, but the question is, what are the deviants from the other norm? You are not to be trusted. What fallout does that have? So I was actually at Rotterdam on regulating ethical failures in October, but that did not come up, so they should be talking to each other, because I think it's perpetuating a type of decision frame that takes that into account. And in that case, integrity-based systems, sending a signal, again implicitly, that this is what we expect of you. And I think that that goes a far way, and where people, the standard that they hold themselves to, may not still diminish my likelihood of believing I behaved more ethical than I really did, but it may increase my desire to behave that way, and maybe increase my planning that occurs around it. That would be a hypothesis that I would have. Yeah, David.
Research about visualization, people actually seeing
That's interesting.
what they want to achieve and accomplish, so that when they're faced with multiple obstacles and choices, they actually do what they've practiced to accomplish.
That's awesome. So no, I do not know that research. That's great. I would love to know about it, because I think that is really what you need to predict accurately, not just how you would like to see yourself behave, standing up to that verbal abuser, but the other possibilities that exist, I think. So visualizing how I'd like to behave, I think, would help. But I've got to visualize how I'd like not to behave and what that might feel like to me. I mean, one of the things I always tell my students is when you look back at things that you've done that you're not proud of, it's always really hard to remember why you did it, right? So you remember you did it, and you're really disappointed in that deviance from your personal standard. But it's the carrot at the time T0 that seems so big, getting the internship, that seems so big, is so little to you much later on. And so I think part of that would require saying this is really so small in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, along those lines, a question about ethical learning and sort of trying to see, looking back from the recollection phase. And I know you talked about this something you do in the negotiation class where you confront students with what they actually did versus their perception in the recollection phase. So I'm wondering if that learning actually works, where you take someone back and say, this is actually, look at the other phases, and if they then can apply that to
That's interesting. Right. So yeah, I haven't measured it. So Norm's talking about in a class that I teach negotiations, they're in an ethical situation that a lot of us use, a case, and I actually have them do it over email so I can actually see their, because what would happen in the debriefs of this, people say, I didn't lie, I didn't mislead you, right? And you would see all these kind of processes at work, and I actually just put up their transcripts and say, let's talk about what you actually did say, and they're horrified because they actually truly believe that they did it, and when they see what they actually wrote, they've already kind of forgotten that they did it. But the response from students has always been, it was the best ethics that I've ever had. I'm dismayed at my own behavior. But they actually weren't even aware, even though they had access to the transcript themselves. They never went back, because that would be a non-confirmatory search. So I didn't go back to look for where I lied. So I actually have never tested, but that's exactly what I'm trying to do in that recollection, is at least highlight, provide more accurate feedback that I think gets hidden in our normal psychological processes. Yeah.
I know that in athletics or in activities, when you visualize something, it has a very similar effect to that. And so it's like building muscle memory, building resilience.
Nice.
And so my
That's
thought
cool.
is that visualizing the desired behavior would result in more likely, you're something you're more likely to go
Interesting.
through that ethical decision. But if you visualize the unethical behavior, I wonder if it could potentially reinforce that downfall or a more likely outcome. So is there anything you said we're debriefing and thinking about it, and not like really visualizing it?
I could see, right. Right, so it's interesting, and I'm sure there's moderators that would make it go one way or the other, the effectiveness of that. So I'm thinking that the more time I had after visualizing me behaving unethically to say that wouldn't be worth it, that it might actually provide feedback pre-decision, right, into that technique. So my only fear is if I'm only thinking about, I think that's kind of what we do in the prediction phase, is we think that we're going to behave good. And maybe and maybe the problem is we don't think about it enough to actually enact it as a routine in our own minds. But my fear is, I think what happens a lot is I just am not aware, because I think part of this is unconscious at the T0. These unconscious forces come over me. And I just got to be ready for that possibility that as much as I want to be this way and I've practiced, that, oh my God, I got to get this job. And I'm just not prepared for that. That's
I think anything interesting, like visualizing the fact that in that moment you're going to have these feelings, visualizing
right.
standing up to those feelings.
So an informed visualization. Okay.
To answer that, actually, I haven't wrote about that, is actually visualizing yourself acting or speaking in a certain situation produces dendrite connections equal to about 40% of actually doing it. So it needs to be done repeatedly. It actually also links it to muscle mass. It actually can also build muscle mass, actually visualizing that you're working out. But for decision making, actually seeing something and react to it.
I wish actually visualizing just gave you the muscle mass. That would be great. Oh, interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
I have a client in Germany, and we have worked on compliance processes. And what he has done, like there's a famous TV series on the German television, and he made like the police officers from the TV series who are like very sympathetic, and everybody just loves them. He made like the logo and like all the presentations we could use like these guys like in the compliance presentation. And now I think like we did that together. I never really thought of like what's happening, but now if you say that's like also like visualizing. People now think of these like really nice guys. They kind of keep these people in mind again,
right?
When talking about compliance, and so
interesting.
yeah, it's funny because I have never looked at it.
So it may.
That could be a way of like using it in organizations and like giving a positive example, like connected to the compliance.
Right. Interesting. Very cool. Yeah.
I was thinking that, and I'm thinking about my own situation, visualizing when you want to behave and reinforcing that in a visual sense, but thinking about how you feel rather than visualizing that. Because for me, all I have to do is go back to times in my life when I didn't stand up, and I could bring that feeling right back. And that was a bad feeling. So providing the possibility.
So, and that's kind of what we're saying, that this accurate planning and reflecting, we don't have that. So accurately planning might include visualization, and accurately reflecting means calling up those bad feelings, right? It's when it gets all hidden that we argue this process is allowed to perpetuate. Do we have time for?
I hate to cut it off. This is such a great and rich discussion, but hopefully it's going to prime us to continue to think about these issues and understand maybe where some trouble is brewing and to be more aware of that. But let's give another thank you.
Thank you, guys. You guys were great. Thank you. Thank you. Go to Michigan.
We have a little token of Michigan for her to take.
Excellent.
Back. So, thank you.
Bring that back. Thank you very much. It was a great, great crowd. Thank you.